Hello, E&M friends. I'm so happy you could join for another episode of the podcast with me today. Today, we get to talk about actually probably my all-time favorite podcast topic. If you know me well, you know this about me. It's authenticity. And today, we're talking about why healthy authenticity is everything to a thriving marriage. Most of you know from my intro, my podcast notes, that I have been working with couples for over 2 decades, and authenticity really takes the cake when it comes to a thriving marriage. But there are reasons that it does. There are also ways that authenticity can be really sticky and not healthy if you're not using it appropriately. So if this is a trait you love and use a lot, stick around because I'm going to hone it with you. And if this is a trait that you're not as used to, it feels very clunky. It feels like this is not a space where you're thriving in. Please. Now I'm like, if you see me on YouTube, stay seated, stay right here. Make sure you keep taking deep breaths because I know when anything for me at least is new and it's hard to learn, it's always like I want to get up and leave. On one of our future episodes, you guys haven't heard yet, but when Leslie Hirschberger comes on again, I have had some gems just recording with me lately, like her. I love her. And she was saying something. I'm like, Leslie, I need to light a candle right now. Like this is getting intense. And I actually have my candle lit here right now, but I actually just love this topic. So I feel really good and comfortable in it. But if you don't, if this is that topic for you that's a little bit scary or daunting, take some deep breaths. You're in the right place if you want a thriving marriage. I promise. And you are going to continue to learn, even if this is already, like I said, one of your top features. Or if we were to say, Myers-Briggs language, we would say one of your top cognitive functions. So we talk a lot about Enneagram here, and that's what we're mostly going to do today. But just keep in mind, this is a function that if you have an Enneagram 4 wing, part of you, arrow, then you know this very well. And if not, you're like, oh, why is this important? So let's start there. The fact that when we talk about the positives of the Enneagram 4, what do we say? We say, oh, we love how they will sit with people in their deepest and most painful places. I remember my nephew once. I came when he was about 20 years old to just to visit him in Michigan, and he was so compassionate to me on even some female issues I was having, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. Like I babysat when you were a baby, and of course my sister being a 3 tells him everything, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, wow, you are loving and kind. And like he just set up like pillows for me. And he was just like meeting me at 1 a.m. when my plane got in and just really like caring for me. And it's just wonderful to be loved like that. And if you have a 4 arrow wing, etc., yourself or are in a relationship with somebody like that, you know how good that feels. But what I want to tell you about marriage is in the long run, whether you have flexed your 4 a lot or not, or even found it matters because it's so important that we all find a space of authenticity. And this just reminds each and every one of us that the goal is to get healthy in your type, but also to get healthy in the types, all of them. And so it's not like you would ever want to be like, oh, I never speak my mind at like an 8 would, or I never bring peace like a 9 would. You would love actually to be as well versed in each of the types as possible. So, in a way, today we're saying the best of type 4 authenticity is really a building block of true intimacy in any relationship. And that's why when you have a type 4 friend and they're in a healthy space, they're able to do that for you. Now, I'm going to talk about how authenticity can be not as healthy as we walk along this journey today. But before we get into even more of the episode, I do want to let you know a couple of E&M announcements. One is, thank goodness, our microphones are back fully, not for just parts of the episode, but the whole. The hurricane things are settling down here in Florida. Everybody's roofs are getting repaired, including mine. We've had some losses. We lost one of our people at our church post hurricane. That was our marriage minister. We are people who here in Florida, and I know this about the Carolinas too, want to help each other. And so please continue to reach out here if there are things that you're still needing. I know several of you have reached out about trauma work. A therapist friend and I were actually today talking at Pure Bar just to say a lot of our couples that are local are extra stressed right now. So you're not alone if that's you. And we also want to continue to remind you of Red Cross, Samaritan's Purse, and places that you can donate to if you're a part of just wanting to make sure you help. And that's so appreciated. And the amount of people who have come to help and serve, it costs. We just had somebody at church who came to serve and then broke their arm because they fell out of a tree. And that's the kind of love that sometimes it takes to really help somebody, is sacrificial love. And we all prayed for that person to feel better. But my point is that when you're trying to find ways to love, there is no counterfeit to actually sacrificing. It's going to cost something. So it doesn't have to be that you help with the hurricane, but just keep in mind that when we're looking at the building blocks, right, of a healthy relationship that's thriving, you heard what I said about my nephew. That's the type 4, that there was care and love and authentic ways, not just, oh, like, let's talk on the surface or let's have fun together, but it was deep and it was real and it was meaningful. And that's the kind of love we've been seeing poured out here in our area too. So even if you feel like people are in a fog a little bit, they are, because it's hard to walk through a big trauma, especially those that stayed and had to endure the sound of, literally sounding like a train barreling at you. It's really, really important that people still show love to each other and show up. And that's all about authenticity anyway. So that little announcement of our sound is better, our town is getting better. There are people who still have whole houses flood. I think we have 4 of them at Pure Bar who still have their whole house flooded. But we are all coming back to do our self-care. And my best friend was really sweet when she said, hey, I just love that you ladies are getting out there and all working out and doing your things. And people are calling every day to see, oh, does your roof need just some patchwork? Does it need tarping? Does it need, um, yes, it definitely needs those little things, but does it also need to be taken off completely? Like, we don't know the answers to those things. What we do know is that we're so thankful. At least for me, I'm so thankful to be home and in a dry, warm home, but also cool home, which has electricity and internet, and our lives are very normal right now. And that is such a gift. And I know not everyone can say that. So continued prayers, that is definitely the biggest E&M announcement. On a professional level, I'm so excited to say that I am working on a writing project. I've mentioned that a little bit, but I was able to get a huge 5-hour writing piece of time this week, which was so hard to ask. I had to be authentic, as well as also just really allowing for myself to celebrate that after I had that happen. So we are still plugging onward and upward for sharing what I have always had on my heart to share. And I'm so thankful. As you know, we hit our 1-year anniversary of the book, and we have more coming this fall. Like I said, great authors, great speakers coming on the podcast soon. We're even going to get to talk to Dr. Dan Siegel. And as I mentioned, Leslie Hirschberger. We're going to be talking to an IFT specialist, Blake Roberts, and so many other wonderful people. And the last announcement before we talk more about authenticity, even though I've been weaving it in the whole time, is I want to make sure you know that next year, which is the next season, 2025, in the middle of our foundational building block episodes like this one, I'm not going to stop those because I think they're important to keep interspersing with our episodes with guests. But what we're going to do is we're going to have couples share who are good communicators and who have the depths to share with us about their story and their journey. Because I think that outside of what I love to write, prescriptive nonfiction, where we're sharing tools, right? Tips that I've seen across 20 years or more that have helped. We also know that humans learn from stories a lot. And I love that as a type 7. And some of my favorite authors, Tolkien and Mark Twain and Dickens and Jane Austen, these are masterful storytellers. And I want couples to come on who are also good at storytelling. And it does not mean you have to be like these classic people. It means just honest, authentic, and willing to share. So I'm so thankful. And I just wanted to put that out there because if you feel like, gosh, we have a story, we've been through something, something that really deserves to be heard and is good for others to learn from. And we know our types, and we also really are doing our work, and we're not afraid to share, and we feel like we have some good communication space, please share that with me. We would love to see if you're a fit for this show in 2025. And that is me coming out of my bubble of not usually doing that with people that I don't know as well. So I'm really excited for this season. I have on my whiteboard over here some really great ideas for the rhythms of those shows. So we'll see how many people. I already have a few, but if I get a lot, then I can make even more of those kinds of shows. But I want to make them quality. So it's okay, however many I get. So thank you for being with me through these announcements. And now let's get deeper into the topic of authenticity. So you already heard me liken authenticity to the space of course, the cognitive function of authenticity in the Myers-Briggs, but also the Enneagram 4. And so remember that as a shortcut. Where is my 4 right now? I'm trying to have a good marriage. How am I being authentic? That's just a starting point. But another way to integrate your Enneagram type is first that self-knowledge, self-awareness. It's a very important building block to authenticity because if you don't know yourself, you're not going to be authentic. And we know sometimes I'll say Enneagram 3s, but many of us can have this struggle, not just 3s. But if you don't know yourself, whatever your type, it's really hard to share that with your spouse. They're like, what are you talking about? You just said you liked this yesterday, which was the opposite. And what complicates this even further, which you might remember from some of our guests who study perimenopause and other symptoms of the female anatomy, is that sometimes across 4 weeks, women will want different things, or across different seasons of life, men and women will both want different things. I know Wes wanted something very different on our date night this week. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was just like, he's like, this is the kind of conversation I want. And it was really new for me to hear that. And I felt like for a moment, he was the typical female of the relationship. And it just was a good reminder to me that men also want empathy sometimes. It was empathy that he was looking for. And it was a really good heart check for me to say, oh, I'm assuming he doesn't normally request that as a 1. And so there was other things I was trying to give. I was trying to give space. I was trying to give, oh, do you want to not have our date tonight? Would that be better for you? And he's like, I want to be with you. I just want empathy. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, this is good to know that when we find out who we are, we must share it. And I'm not used to him saying that as a 1. And in fact, most of the rest of the date night, he didn't even seem to want that much. But in 1 minute, he was different. So know that sometimes it can feel like, gosh, my partner is acting different. And it's also because their hormones are changing, seasons are changing. Maybe they're a male and their testosterone is changing up and down. You don't know what's going on with them, but let them try to be authentic with you, whatever is going on. And so if you can first check in with yourself, how am I feeling? What am I thinking? And what do I need to do? That is a great place to start. Because if you're just flying all over with your spouse, they can chase you. Like I said, we can chase each other down, and we will, and we do. That's what marriage is. And that's why it's long, because we're like, wait, what? That happens all the time. But even better is when we've taken time to digest what's going on with us, and we can say that to our spouse or partner and say, I'm really doing great. Here's what I have to offer today, or I'm struggling, and this is what I'm going to need. And if your spouse doesn't have the best memory, you might have to say that a number of times before they really get it. You may say, I told you on Thursday, and they've forgotten already. And you have to remind them a few times. And some of our Enneagram 9s, for instance, are so frustrated by that because it feels like, oh my gosh, I already told you, forget it. Maybe I'm not important. But what I want to encourage you is, whether you are a 9 or you just have moments in that 9 space, it's so healthy and healing for you to speak up for what's really happening inside you. Because let's just say that there's a part of you, which we love to use internal family systems language here sometimes, just the parts language. There's a part of you that wants to be that perfect, ideal spouse who doesn't have many needs, who's just very loving. And yet there's another part of you that very much understands that in this moment you do. You maybe have a bad headache or you're exhausted, and it's something your spouse needs to know in the context of your evening or your morning or your planned date together. So self-awareness means what is going on now and trying to get that authentic, as you've heard me say many times, self-preservation going well, so that you might say, oh yes, I can be with you in a little while. Let me take a quick cat nap, or let me take a walk, or let me have a little introversion time before I do that. Now, with us being a self-pres myself and a social my husband, and I feel like I'm more of the self-pres slash sexual, in that I do love the one-to-one. I still need much more alone time than him. He doesn't resonate with needing it that much. And I know that he really needs it. Trust me, there's so many things about the self-pres instinct that we all need. And I've talked about those before, and I hope you've caught those episodes where I go into these in detail, because you'll definitely hear me doing that more in the future. That's like my number two thing. If I said authenticity is one, it's like these instincts are so key as well. Um, but that said, it's so important when we can say to each other, I have gotten my self-care and I'm ready for you. I am ready to be authentic and to come to you with authenticity that isn't immature because I haven't done my own work. It's authenticity that's maturing, and it's not perfectly arrived. No one has fully arrived, but it's a part of us that says, I have been in places of stress. I have taken care of whatever I could take care of. And here I am to meet you with the best I can bring to you. And maybe that's very little. Maybe you've just had a baby and you're like, yeah, I tried. I took a cat nap. The baby woke me up 5 times. Like, one of my best friends just had a baby. And I'm sure she's going through moments like that. I only talked to her the day she had the baby, but I can't wait to catch up and see how that's going, because this is a surprise baby that came later. And I think that those are things that we expect, right? That there's going to be a lot of conversations about just, I'm tired and here's the best of me. And it's authentic. And it's important to be authentic, but it isn't, I expect you to meet every need. And sometimes, guys, and if I've lost you, come back to me. This is so important. If you're a person who uses authenticity or wants to use it well, you need to know that your partner cannot do all the work for you if you haven't done that work of self-care and self-knowledge. You need to know that those are so key for you to do before you ask them to meet your needs, because it will be very ugly if you don't know yourself or you're not taking any self-care and you're just asking them to baby you and take care of you, because you are an adult. And as hard as it is sometimes to be an adult, you do have some choices. You don't have every choice, but you do have some choices. You have choices of, will you scroll on your phone, or will you take a walk? Will you eat a healthier dinner? Will you take a moment to pause? These are things that you do have most of the time options for. And the healthier you act and choose to behave within your field of authenticity, the more you're going to be healthy. And sometimes people can misunderstand authenticity instead to mean that they are just, please love me for who I am, even if I'm doing absolutely nothing to better myself or this relationship. And that is a recipe for disaster and divorce, because nobody wants to be with a bump on a log. Maybe some people will, they're just super high on compassion and patience, but it won't be good for them. It will be you dragging them down. So you have to understand that with authenticity comes responsibility to try to be the best version of yourself. That is absolutely enormous. Now, another part of authenticity outside of this self-awareness and trying to be yourself is the vulnerability piece. This is a little harder for some of us, myself included, but there are ways and strategies I have come to learn over the years. Don't worry, you can learn them too. It's very important that you do so. And one of those pieces I've learned is that just telling my partner how I struggle with vulnerability is part of being vulnerable, right? To say, this is hard for me. I don't like heavy emotions. Sometimes when Wes does his poetic apologetics, I'm like, oh, these are hard for me to hear because you get emotional with your voice. And I appreciate it, but it's almost like I want to watch from behind a tree, because this kind of exposure is a little hard. And some of you know I have a very big part of me that's like a type 5, where big emotions are overwhelming and intense. And presumably that's probably because my type 8 dad, who I really do think was an 8, 4, 6, all three of the most exposing types, just was so dramatic and so unpredictable with his mood swings that it was something that really, of course, was honed in on me. Even my siblings all had the sexual, I think, dominant instinct. So it was like there's a lot of intensity in the home. And it was like, these people need a lot of attention. I'm just going to go over here and we're going to keep my emotions at bay. And that's how we're going to manage things. And so when emotions come my way in this quest for vulnerability, it's wonderful as a helper when my clients do, because I can help them and keep my head on straight and, get moved in my heart. I mean, today at church, I was moved twice to tears, but it's not something that I can't control. Whereas when I'm really, and we know this about vulnerability, and when you're really vulnerable, it means you're open to exposure, you're open to a lack of control, and that's really hard. And so I can tell my clients, I told my son that today, like he was like, Mom, if you do this speaking engagement, here's what it might interfere with me. I'm like, oh, you're a thinking type also. Like, open your hands to God. Like, that's not even for literally months. Like, let's allow ourselves to let God work that out. And also, thank you for telling me how you feel vulnerably in the meantime, that you would like to have some healthy control around that. And that's what you can tell your spouse too, is I would love to have some healthy control, even as I'm trying to be vulnerable here with this or that situation. And that takes honesty, even when you're still learning yourself what's happening. So, for instance, your spouse may say, What's going on with you lately? And you've done as much self awareness work as you can. And you're just like, I'm just feeling really exposed right now. There's part of me that feels like I'm not really safe with you. And here's why: I feel very vulnerable. And then they get the chance to know what's happening. Maybe you say, You've been late a lot lately, and it feels like I'm just losing some trust, or you've been snapping at me. What's going on? Or it could be something totally different, like I up leveled at work, and that happened to me at one point too. And I remember how vulnerable I felt. And sometimes shame rides in. And so you have to be able to have safe places to share this. And if your spouse is not that person, and you're like, oh, that's the worst person to do that with because that just feels like double exposure, then make sure you're doing that with healthy others. And I do hope eventually it can be your spouse. But some of your spouses are also not comfortable being vulnerable. And I don't buy the statistic that we have to do every part of our growing with our spouse. But I do think for the healthiest marriages, it's people who are trying to be vulnerable. Even if it's, like I said, sometimes just to say being vulnerable is hard for me. And to me, that feels very vulnerable when I say that to Wes. And he seems to also agree with that. And he's not a 4, so he's not like dying for that, but it really like helps him to process, why is this or that hard for her? But he also loves it that my first boyfriend, when he came back to try to talk to me years and years later, I was just able to shut him down without even a second thought, because I was like, oh no, like I don't go to that level of vulnerability with people that I'm not close to, like at all. And so Wes is going to write you that email. And I've talked about that on this podcast before, but it's like there are really good ways that you can use your vulnerability to also set boundaries so that you're not overly vulnerable where you don't need to be. And that's still being authentic, because you're still able to say, okay, how does vulnerability work in my life? What are my triggers? What are the ways that I like to make sure I'm safe? What are and who are the people? What are the situations where I can be the most exposed and vulnerable in without toppling over mentally? And let me try that in my marriage as much as possible. And that's definitely what I've done. And I'm so grateful my spouse has accepted my boundaries, but also honored the ways I have shared. And lastly, on this topic, my friends, one thing you can do if you feel like you need a bit more of a cushion is you can say to your spouse as a precursor, I have something really vulnerable to say to you. So when would be a good time to share that, when you would probably more likely be able to hear me and honor what's going on in my life? And that way, they're probably much more likely to support you versus if you approach them when they have a cold or they're exhausted or they've just had a fight with their mother. Like, you've got to remember that people are complex systems. So it doesn't mean just because they rejected you when you were trying to be vulnerable that they're always going to do that. Now, another part of vulnerability and authenticity, especially, is the open communication piece. That is the piece when you are not mincing words and trying to have your spouse read your mind. And I'm just going to go through that briefly, but a lot of my couples over the years, including myself, have felt like, oh my gosh, we're just supposed to have that fairy tale marriage where everything comes easy and we expect our spouse to know what we want. We expect them to really read our minds. And instead, it's so much healthier to say, what is their Enneagram type to yourself, and how do they usually communicate best? So for instance, ones, threes, and fives are really good with logic. Two, sevens, and nines are really good with positivity. And four, sixes, and eights really thrive on reactivity and passion. So when you pair all three, this kind of communication really keeps things open and moving and fluid. And that's what I teach my couples week in and week out. So keep your communication open, but also just know this is who my spouse is and this is how they communicate. So when I know Wes is stressed, he's going to show up as some of the lesser healthy traits of the type one that you can go back to my book. I'm sure most of our listeners here have it by now. And you can say, oh gosh, this is my spouse. They're just at the lower part of their type because they're stressed right now. Or let's be honest, right? We all have those heuristics that make us feel we're healthier. Let's go to my type. Oh, this is me a little less healthy. And hopefully you're going to do your work. And we'll briefly mention that work again if you're like, what's my work again? But we'll mention that at the end. But the next piece for healthy authenticity is acceptance, is knowing that, just as I said, whatever these types are, just I love them and I love myself with our flaws and all. It is so important that we have that kind of grace for each other. And as you heard me say earlier, it doesn't mean I want you to stop growing. That would be just so detrimental if you felt like you heard that here. You didn't. Maybe you AI'd it, but you did not hear that here. We are all about making sure that you are always growing. I just think that's the very best way to live, and serving, but also authenticity is important, and being loved and loving yourself and your partner with that is just everything to me. Just that acceptance of this is who they are. This is where they're from. This is their strength part of them. This is their weakness part. And then what boundaries do I need in order to keep my compassion and my diplomacy, with them, so that we can still decide and make compromises and still honor each other, but also understand that we are needs and we're people too. And, I got that from my mom inadvertently, where I saw her literally lay her life down for my dad in so many ways, but also lose herself mentally. So it's been a helpful narrative for me to, still be learning from my amazing mother. And that all will bring this positive impact on your intimacy. All of this will just be such a gift to you guys. And I did want to add, of course, as you're thinking about all of this, if you do feel like, what is my work to do? Remember that the big work you can be doing is to balance out your instincts. I always say that it's getting that self preservation where you've gotten your relational window of tolerance with your rest, with your food, just knowing yourself, having your time with God, setting your values back up. This is all a baseline for being your best and doing your work. And that will help you when you're looking for open communication and you're trying to figure out, how much vulnerability am I going to share? Oh, yeah, this is one of my values around that. I try to share a lot, but not so much that I get depressed or feel shamed, or there are certain people that make me feel good, even though they might be challenging me to do better, but they also love me right where I am. And all of that is part of this baseline of care of you doing your work. And of course, I don't want you finding people who are just going to give you a pat when you're actually doing a poor job. I want them to hopefully hold with you to figure out why, curiously, compassionately, but also challenging you to do better, because they know you can. And these are the people that love you. And John Gottman, the number one marriage researcher in the world, says, our marriages are comprised of two people who are trying to, and actually usually succeeding in, making each other less crazy. So let's allow that in marriage. Let's allow some accountability. Let's allow you to do your work so you can come back to them with love and with authenticity. And then you can find out together what you really want, right? Because then from that bottom baseline instinct of self-pres, we move into the sexual instinct, and you guys get to figure out, what do we love for intimacy building together? What do we compromise on here? How can we merge sexually and also just in our conversations and plan adventures? And then how can we give socially in the world to others who are in need? How can we receive socially? How can we connect socially? We're social creatures. We need each other. So those are just so many ways you're going to have such success in your marriage, guys. I'm so proud of you for sticking with me through this episode, because this is why authenticity is everything to a thriving marriage. If you're not honest, if you're not real, if you don't know yourself, if your spouse doesn't know the real you, if they don't see any attempts at vulnerability or self awareness or open communication or acceptance of them and yourself, your marriage is just going to be built on such a shaky foundation otherwise. And I just don't want that for you. So, this was one of our building block episodes through the year. I hope you enjoyed it with me. I hope you were also able to light a candle or have a walk or relax. And I'm just glad you were here with me for the journey. I want to remind you that we are going to have our episode as usual on Wednesday in our deeper dive episode series as well. My collective friends, I hope to see you this Wednesday at our group meeting. We're back up for that. We had to cancel it 2 weeks ago because of the hurricane, and we're back, and I'm so grateful. I will talk to you guys soon. Bye bye.